Imagine closing your eyes tonight and waking up in a world where Rome is just another backwater trading town on the Italian peninsula, and the Greeks, not the Romans, write the story of the West. No Latin inscriptions carved into marble, no Roman legions marching across Europe, and not a single centurion helmet making it into a Hollywood movie. Instead, Plato and Aristotle get the last laugh, their philosophies shaping not just libraries, but the governments and empires of a whole planet. It's a strange thought, isn't it? A history where Julius Caesar is remembered as a curious provincial statesman who never quite made it, while Alexander's successors build something that lasts. What if Greece never fell to Rome? Welcome back to the still past, where we wander down the quiet corridors of forgotten history and ask those small, impossible questions that keep your mind busy as you drift into rest. Tonight, we're asking, what if ancient Greece never lost its place at the center of the world? But before you settle in, make sure you're comfortable. Turn on the fan if you need to, pull the blankets close, and let yourself sink into the quiet. And if you'd like to keep traveling with me through history, do well to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. You can also tell me which period of history you'd love to hear next. I always read through your ideas. Now, with the world growing still, let's begin our journey.
Here's the thing. Rome didn't steamroll Greece overnight. By the time Rome started flexing its muscles, Greece had already spent centuries squabbling like siblings, fighting over who ate the last olive. City-states like Athens and Sparta were brilliant, but also catastrophically bad at long-term teamwork. When Alexander the Great tried to glue them together, he succeeded, but only briefly. After his death, the empire cracked apart like a dropped amphora, leaving Rome free to swoop in later. But what if they'd held together? What if Alexander's successors didn't immediately stab each other in the back? Picture a Greece that learns from its mistakes, unifies under a stronger system, and maybe decides Rome isn't much more than a noisy neighbor with fancy roads. And just to be clear, I'm not saying the Greeks would have outlawed togas or banned gladiator games. But let's be honest, if Athens were in charge, the Colosseum would probably have been turned into the world's biggest open-air philosophy classroom, which, depending on your tolerance for Socratic questioning, is either a dream come true or a nightmare worse than facing a lion.
When people think of Greece, they often picture white marble temples, men in togas arguing about the meaning of justice, or statues that have somehow survived thousands of years without a nose. And to be fair, that isn't far from the truth. Ancient Greece was less a single nation and more a patchwork quilt of fiercely independent city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each with its own customs, armies, and very strong opinions about what counted as civilized. Athens gave us democracy, though if you weren't a male citizen over 18, you didn't get much of a say. Sparta built its reputation on producing warriors so tough they thought curtains were a sign of weakness. And then there was Corinth, where money, trade, and a little bit of scandal flowed as freely as the wine. The Greeks weren't just brilliant, they were also brilliantly argumentative. If two Athenians agreed on something, it usually meant a third was about to write a play mocking them for it. Despite all that bickering, Greek culture burned brightly. Philosophy, mathematics, theater, architecture, the Greeks were laying down the blueprints of Western civilization, while Rome was still figuring out whether its kings should wear crowns or not. For centuries, Greece was the teacher and Rome the student. Then came Alexander the Great. Picture a man barely in his 20s, charging across the known world at such a pace that his soldiers often complained they couldn't keep up. In just over a decade, Alexander built an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt and all the way to India. His soldiers carried not just spears, but also Greek language, ideas, and art. Suddenly, everyone from Babylon to the Nile was debating Aristotle and building theaters. This period became known as the Hellenistic Age, when Greek culture turned into a kind of ancient international brand. But, and here's the catch, Alexander died young. Too much ambition, too much wine, and probably too many battle scars. He left no clear heir, and his generals quickly turned the empire into a family feud so dramatic it would have made a great soap opera. They carved up the territories, each wanting to be the next Alexander, and in the process, weakened Greece's hold on power.
Meanwhile, in Italy, Rome was watching all this like the kid at the back of the classroom who suddenly realizes the teacher has dropped the answer key. Rome had started small, a city-state with a knack for building roads and organizing armies. They didn't have the artistic flair of Athens or the philosophical depth of Plato, but what they did have was discipline and patience. Lots of patience. Over the next few centuries, Rome steadily grew, swallowing up its neighbors one by one. And when it turned its gaze toward the east, it found a divided Greece, a land still rich in culture, but politically fractured, easy pickings for a well-trained Roman legion. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had done it. Greece was conquered. The philosophers who once shaped kings now tutored Roman aristocrats. The marble statues were hauled off to decorate Roman villas. Even Greek gods were adopted, giving new Latin names like Jupiter and Venus. The student had become the master, though in truth, Rome never stopped being a little bit Greek at heart. Here's the thing, though. It didn't have to end that way. If Alexander's successors had held together, if Athens and Sparta had managed to get along for more than 5 minutes, if Greece had realized Rome was more than just an overeager cousin across the sea, history could have tilted very differently. And so we ask, what if Greece never fell to Rome? What if the philosophers kept their empire, the temples kept their power, and the Mediterranean stayed Greek instead of Roman? That's where our story begins. When we imagine Greece standing firm against Rome, we're not talking about Athens or Sparta alone. By the time Rome was on the rise, both of those old rivals had seen their glory days. What mattered was the larger Hellenistic world, the empire Alexander had built, and the culture it spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean and Near East. To picture Greece never falling to Rome, we have to imagine a Greece that stayed united, or at least united enough to resist Rome's methodical expansion. In real history, Rome's greatest strength wasn't necessarily its innovation, but its ability to absorb others. They conquered, copied, and improved. The Romans didn't invent the arch, but they perfected it. They didn't create philosophy, but they devoured Greek ideas and claimed them as part of their own legacy. They weren't the first to raise standing armies, but they mastered the art of drilling soldiers until they functioned like clockwork. Rome's genius was to take the brilliance of others, organize it, and then project it outward through conquest. But in our alternate path, let's shift one detail. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals, known as the Diadochi, don't tear the empire into fragments. Instead of years of civil wars, betrayals, and alliances that crumble overnight, imagine them forging a stable arrangement. Perhaps a council of successors governs collectively, keeping the empire intact. It's not a single king, but a federation of rulers bound by shared loyalty to Alexander's legacy. This alone would have changed the balance of power. A united Hellenistic empire stretching from Greece to Egypt and Persia would have dwarfed Rome in its early years. Rome, still fighting wars with Carthage and struggling to dominate the Italian peninsula, would have looked across the Adriatic and seen a titan it could not challenge. Rome might still expand, yes, but only into Gaul, Iberia, or North Africa, always careful not to cross into Greek waters. The first great difference lies in governance. Rome gave us the Senate, the Republic, and eventually the autocratic Caesars. But Greece, if it held together, would have offered something very different. A mixture of monarchy aristocracy, and democracy, all wrapped in a cloak of philosophy. Athens had pioneered democracy, though flawed by its exclusions. Sparta embodied oligarchy, harsh but stable. Macedon, under Alexander, proved monarchy could unify Greeks under the right leader. If a lasting Hellenic empire formed, its politics might have blended these systems. Imagine a council of city-states contributing representatives to a larger imperial assembly, with kings or governors overseeing provinces, but answerable to the collective. It's messy, but it's Greek. Argument elevated to governments. This wouldn't have been democracy as we know it today, but it would have been a world where debate and persuasion mattered as much as military rank. Laws might be crafted with reference to Aristotle's teachings on justice, or Plato's vision of an ideal state, rather than Rome's legal code. And instead of emperors with near-divine power, Greece's rulers might have faced constant scrutiny from councils, philosophers, and citizens alike. The ripple effects are immense. Without Rome's centralized imperial model, Europe would grow under the influence of federated Greek-style politics. Ideas of representation, councils, and public debate might spread earlier and wider. Democracy wouldn't need to be rediscovered in the Enlightenment. Its seeds would already be embedded across the continent. What happens to Rome in this world? Rome becomes what it once was, a regional power, influential but not dominant. Instead of legions storming into Greece, Rome would settle for alliances and trade. Its generals might dream of conquest, but the reality of facing a united Hellenistic empire would be too daunting. Rome's culture would look very different too. No Greek conquest means no great influx of Greek art, philosophy, and literature into Rome. The Romans admired and adopted Greek culture only after they had conquered Greece. Without that, Latin might remain a provincial tongue, while Greek remains the language of prestige, scholarship, and power.
In this timeline, Rome is remembered as a proud but secondary civilization, a place of regional importance but not the center of an empire. Julius Caesar might live and die as a respected politician, his ambitions never stretching far beyond Italy. Roman architecture, law, and administration might survive in smaller pockets, but the world would never become Romanized. Now let's turn to the wider Mediterranean. In our world, Rome created what it called Mare Nostrum, our sea, by conquering all the lands around it. In the alternate world, that sea belongs firmly to Greece. The Mediterranean becomes a Greek lake, with Alexandria, Athens, and Antioch serving as great hubs of culture and commerce. Trade flows not through Rome's roads, but along Greek sea routes. Theaters, temples, and gymnasia spread along the coasts, from Spain to Egypt. The symbols of Greek culture, columns, amphitheaters, and schools, dot every major city. This also means Carthage, Rome's great rival in real history, faces a different fate. Instead of clashing with Rome in the Punic Wars, Carthage would likely trade and compete with Greece. The Carthaginians were masters of commerce, and a stable Greek empire would recognize their value as partners. The great wars between Rome and Carthage never happen. Hannibal never marches elephants across the Alps, and Carthage, spared destruction, might remain a wealthy power on the African coast, tied into the Hellenic world rather than crushed by Rome. One of Rome's defining traits was militarism. Conquest drove its expansion, wealth, and glory. But a Greek-dominated world would operate differently. Greek warfare was fierce, but the Greeks valued culture, trade, and learning as much as battle. A stable Hellenistic empire wouldn't need to expand endlessly. It already controls vast territory. Instead of funneling resources into legions and wars of conquest, Greece could channel its wealth into education, architecture, and exploration. That doesn't mean a peaceful utopia. Greek politics was rarely calm. Rivalries between regions and rulers would continue. But instead of Rome's centralized imperial conquest, we might see a Mediterranean where influence is projected through ideas and culture more than sheer force. This has another consequence. Without Rome's emphasis on citizenship tied to military service, identity in this world would revolve more around cultural belonging. To be Greek is not necessarily to be born in Greece, but to adopt Greek language, customs, and education. This was already true in Alexander's empire. Persians, Egyptians, and others embraced Hellenistic culture. In the alternate timeline, that identity becomes even more widespread. The Mediterranean and Near East become thoroughly Greek in spirit. The most intriguing question is how this alternate Greece shapes the future. If Rome never rises as the great empire, then Western civilization never has its Roman foundation. Instead, the Greek tradition carries forward uninterrupted. That means politics shaped by assemblies, not emperors. It means law shaped by philosophy, not Roman legal codes. It means identity shaped by culture and language, not by conquest. And crucially, it means Europe and the Mediterranean never forget the intellectual treasures of Greece because they remain at the center of power. The so-called rediscovery of Greek texts during the Renaissance would be unnecessary. They were never lost. Universities across the empire would teach Plato and Aristotle without interruption. Science, mathematics, and philosophy might advance centuries earlier. The very structure of government, education, and daily life across the Western world would carry Greek fingerprints, not Roman ones. To imagine Greece never falling to Rome is to imagine a Mediterranean where culture triumphs over conquest, and where the rhythm of history is shaped less by legions and more by debate. Rome taught the world order and law. Greece taught it thought and beauty. In our real history, Rome wore the crown, but it was always a crown decorated with Greek jewels. In this alternate history, Greece keeps the crown for itself, and the world that follows speaks in the language of Homer, debates in the spirit of Socrates, and builds its future not on conquest, but on curiosity.
If Greece never fell to Rome, life across Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond would look familiar in some ways and startlingly different in others. We wouldn't be speaking of aqueducts, gladiatorial games, or centurions. Instead, daily rhythms would be set by the Greek polis, the theater, the gymnasium, and the agora. Where Rome gave us empire and military order, Greece gave us philosophy, art, and a certain obsession with asking questions that never really end. In this alternate history, it is the Greek way of life, not the Roman, that shapes the ordinary existence of millions. Let's begin with the cities. A Romanized Europe is full of roads, amphitheaters, and military camps that grow into towns. But in our Greek world, the architectural DNA is different. Picture a landscape of marble colonnades, temples, stoas, and open squares where citizens gather to talk, argue, and exchange goods. The agora, that bustling central marketplace, becomes the heartbeat of every settlement. It's where you buy bread and olive oil, where you hear the latest news, and where philosophers set up shop to lecture anyone who doesn't walk away fast enough. The Romans gave us forums with their grandeur and law courts. But the Greeks gave us spaces designed for conversation, for the daily mingling of people and ideas. Imagine this not only in Athens, but in Gaul, Iberia, Britain, and Egypt. A Mediterranean dotted with agoras, each alive with voices. Architecture follows the Greek style too. Instead of vast Roman arches and domes, cities rise with elegant columns, symmetrical temples, and open-air theaters. Even provincial towns boast miniature Parthenons, not colosseums. The aesthetic is lighter, less about demonstrating brute power, more about harmony, proportion, and beauty. Walking into one of these cities, you'd feel less overwhelmed and more invited, as though the city itself were a work of art encouraging you to participate.
Roman life, as we know, leaned heavily on spectacle. Gladiators fought to the death, naval battles were staged in flooded arenas, and chariot races turned into riots. The Greeks had their spectacles too, but they took a different form. In this Greek-dominated world, entertainment looks more like theater, festivals, and athletic contests. Imagine vast open-air theaters across the empire, where comedies, tragedies, and philosophical dramas are performed. People flock not to see gladiators spill blood, but to watch actors wrestle with the meaning of justice, love, and fate. Children grow up knowing lines from Sophocles instead of chants from the Colosseum. Then there are the games. The Olympic tradition, already ancient by Rome's time, becomes the central sporting event of the empire. Every few years, athletes gather to compete in running, wrestling, discus, and more. Victors are celebrated not as soldiers, but as champions of skill and endurance. Local versions of the game spread everywhere. Small towns in Gaul hosting mini-Olympics, villages in Iberia holding foot races in honor of Zeus or Athena. This doesn't mean life is without danger or excitement. Wrestling matches could still be brutal, and rival city festivals often devolve into chaos. But the culture celebrates excellence in mind and body, not the thrill of public executions. It's a different flavor of spectacle, less bloody, more thoughtful, though perhaps no less passionate. So what does an ordinary day look like in this Greek world? For many, it begins with the rising sun over tiled roofs and whitewashed houses. Breakfast might be bread dipped in olive oil, figs, and goat cheese. Farmers head out into the fields of wheat, vineyards, or olive groves, while artisans set up in their workshops, crafting pottery, weaving cloth, or shaping bronze. The gymnasium plays a central role in daily life. More than a place to exercise, it is a cultural hub. Men gather to train their bodies, but also to discuss politics, philosophy, and local gossip. Young boys are educated here, learning not just physical skills, but also rhetoric, mathematics, and music. The gymnasium is half school, half community center. In a Greek-dominated Europe, gymnasia spread everywhere, embedding the Greek ideal of a balanced mind and body into daily routines.
Religion weaves into everyday moments, too. Small shrines to household gods sit in courtyards, while larger temples anchor city life. Festivals punctuate the calendar, days of sacrifice, parades, theater, and music dedicated to the gods. In Rome's world, religion became formalized under the empire, eventually replaced by Christianity. In this Greek world, the older traditions of honoring the Olympian gods remained vibrant much longer, woven into the rhythm of markets and meals. For the elite, life is steeped in education. Wealthy families send their children to study philosophy, literature, and science. Tutors quote Homer, Aristotle, and Archimedes. Even in distant provinces, Greek becomes the language of the educated, binding the empire through culture rather than conquest. One of the subtler shifts in this alternate world is the role of women. In classical Athens, women were largely confined to domestic life, while in Sparta, they enjoyed more freedom and authority. In the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander, women sometimes held significant power. Think of queens like Cleopatra in our world. If Greece dominated instead of Rome, it's possible the more flexible models from the Hellenistic age would prevail. Women in Egypt, Anatolia, and Macedon often engaged in trade, managed estates, and even participated in intellectual circles. Without Rome's heavily patriarchal structures becoming dominant, perhaps women across the Mediterranean would see earlier opportunities in commerce, education, and even governance. We shouldn't imagine complete equality. It was still the ancient world. But the pathways for female influence might open sooner, shaping family life, inheritance, and education in subtle but important ways. Language is where the shift becomes most obvious.
In our history, Latin spread through Rome's conquests, becoming the ancestor of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Greek, while influential, remained more confined to the Eastern Mediterranean.
In this alternate world, Greek becomes the lingua franca everywhere. From the streets of Iberia to the hills of Gaul, from North Africa to Britain, people speak Greek in markets, courts, and classrooms. Local languages survive, of course, but Greek holds prestige, unifying the empire. The world doesn't grow up on Latin proverbs, but on Homeric verses. Instead of Julius Caesar's Veni, Vidi, Vici, the catchphrase of conquest is Alexander's Tales of the East, retold in Greek. This has ripple effects. Christianity, when it emerges, is written and spread in Greek. The New Testament already was originally in Greek, but in this timeline, it remains the dominant sacred language. There is no Latin Vulgate Bible, no Roman Church shaping doctrine in Latin. Instead, Christianity feels more Greek from the start, intertwined with Greek philosophy and culture. The sermons echo Aristotle as much as they echo Paul. Daily life is profoundly shaped by education in this Greek order. Romans valued practical knowledge, law, and military training. Greeks valued philosophy, rhetoric, and the pursuit of wisdom for its own sake. In our alternate history, this emphasis spreads widely. Towns across Europe maintain schools where children learn to read and write in Greek, study geometry and astronomy, and practice rhetoric. Public speaking isn't a rare talent, it's expected. The art of persuasion becomes as central to daily life as farming or trade. This educational framework lays foundations for scientific inquiry too. Archimedes' principles, Euclid's geometry, and Aristotle's theories become not dusty scrolls rediscovered in the Renaissance, but living parts of school curricula across the centuries. Imagine a world where scientific thought matures centuries earlier, where inventions and discoveries accelerate because Greek curiosity never goes underground. Meals carry their own story. In a Roman world, banquets featured exotic delicacies, roasted meats, and elaborate sauces. In a Greek world, meals are simpler but more communal. Bread, olives, fish, cheese, figs, and wine dominate. Trade spreads these staples across the empire. Olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, grain from Egypt, all circulate along Greek-controlled sea routes. Markets bustle with local produce, but also with spices from the east, fabrics from Anatolia, and papyrus from Egypt. Eating isn't just about nourishment, it's social, often accompanied by symposia, those semi-formal drinking parties where music, poetry, and conversation flow. Daily diets are modest compared to Roman feasts, but the culture around food emphasizes sharing, hospitality, and discussion. The table is less about excess and more about community. Religion, woven into everyday life, remains vibrant. Every city honors its patron gods with processions, sacrifices, and festivals. Temples stand not as relics, but as active centers of worship. Without Roman dominance, Greek polytheism likely remains more entrenched. Christianity still spreads, it always finds a way, but it grows in a Greek context, shaped by philosophy and open debate. Early Christians might argue their theology in the language of Plato, finding common ground with Greek traditions of questioning and reason. This delays or alters the way Christianity becomes institutionalized. Instead of a centralized Roman Catholic Church,
You might have a more diverse, decentralized Christian world, blended with Greek traditions. Religion becomes less about uniformity and more about dialogue. What truly defines daily life in this alternate world is the Greek emphasis on balance between mind and body, between community and individual, between tradition and inquiry. Children grow up surrounded by art and stories of gods, but also by questions. What is justice? What is beauty? What is truth? Farmers discuss politics in the marketplace. Merchants recite poetry. Even in small villages, the echoes of Greek thought reach people's ears. Life is still hard. Disease, hunger, and war exist, but the culture that frames it is one of curiosity and conversation.
When Greece stands tall and Rome never conquers, the world's daily rhythm changes. Cities are shaped not by emperors, but by citizens in their agoras. Entertainment is thoughtful, not bloody. Education is widespread, not reserved for elites. Language unites vast regions under Greek, not Latin. Religion grows in dialogue with philosophy. It's not a utopia. Greek rivalries and human ambition would still cause conflict, but it is a different world, one where millions live in the shade of marble columns instead of Roman arches, and where daily life is less about empire and more about ideas. In this alternate history, to live an ordinary day is to live in conversation with philosophy, in celebration of art, and in constant awareness that you are part of something called Hellenism, a culture that values not only survival, but the search for meaning in how we live.
Language is the invisible architecture of civilization. It is more than words on parchment or sounds in the air. It is how people think, how they remember, how they explain the world to their children. When empires rise, they do more than conquer land. They conquer speech. In our own history, Latin became the language of law, administration, and eventually the church, leaving its fingerprints across Europe in French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. Greek remained important, but increasingly confined to the Eastern Mediterranean. But in this alternate world, where Greece never fell to Rome, the story is very different. Instead of Latin marching westward with Roman legions, it is Greek that crosses mountains, rivers, and seas, carried not by conquest alone, but by culture, commerce, and prestige. The result is a world where Greek becomes the universal language, not just of scholars, but of farmers, priests, merchants, and poets. To live in this world is to live in the echo of Homer, to conduct business in the tongue of Aristotle, and to pray in the same language as the Gospels. Greek already had a head start. By the time Rome was rising, Greek had been the language of culture for centuries. Alexander's conquests had spread it from Egypt to India, and the Hellenistic kingdoms maintained it as the common tongue. Even in our world, Roman elites admired Greek, studied Greek, and sent their children to learn Greek philosophy. In this alternate timeline, without Rome conquering Greece, Latin never gains dominance. Rome itself adopts Greek for diplomacy and learning, recognizing it as the superior cultural language. Across Europe, Greek replaces Latin in courts, schools, and trade. In Gaul, Iberia, and Britain, Greek becomes the second language of villagers, the primary language of towns, and the unquestioned language of administration.
This has profound consequences. Instead of a Europe divided into Romance languages rooted in Latin, Europe grows up speaking dialects of Greek, blended with local tongues. The vocabulary of philosophy, science, and governance spreads through Greek, not Latin. Centuries later, instead of Italian, French, and Spanish being sister languages, you might have countless regional Greek dialects, all mutually intelligible in their roots, all tied to the same intellectual tradition. With Greek as the dominant language, the written tradition looks very different. The Greeks had already developed a rich literary culture. Epics,
plays, histories, and philosophy. In this alternate world, that tradition spreads westward into every corner of the empire. Provincial towns don't just copy Roman laws into Latin, they copy Homer, Sophocles, and Herodotus into Greek. Education reinforces this. Schools across the empire teach children to read and write in Greek. Merchants record contracts in Greek. Priests inscribe prayers in Greek. Knowledge flows more freely because the empire speaks with one tongue, not dozens. Translation becomes less of an obstacle. A scholar in Iberia can read a text written in Alexandria without mediation. The barrier between East and West, North and South, shrinks. And here lies one of the greatest differences: the preservation of knowledge. In our world, many Greek texts were lost in the West when Latin took over, only to be rediscovered centuries later through Arabic translations. In this alternate history, Greek remains alive everywhere. Plato never vanishes from European memory. Aristotle isn't locked in Byzantine monasteries waiting to be carried back through Islamic Spain. The West never loses the ancient world. It carries it continuously. One of the most striking changes concerns religion. Christianity, as it arose in the 1st century CE, was deeply tied to Greek. The New Testament was written in Greek, not Latin. Paul's letters traveled across the Eastern Mediterranean in Greek. Early Christian communities prayed and debated in Greek. In our history, Latin gradually became the language of the Western Church, while Greek remained in the East. This created the famous split between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. In our alternate world, there is no such sharp divide. Greek remains the sacred language of Christianity everywhere. Churches from Spain to Egypt read their scriptures in the same words, in the same cadences, without the mediation of Latin translations. This shapes theology itself. Latin theology tended to emphasize law, order, and hierarchy, influenced by Rome's legal culture. Greek theology, by contrast, emphasized mystery, philosophy, and the search for truth through reason. If Christianity remains Greek, its character across Europe becomes more contemplative, less juridical. Salvation might be described in metaphors of light and knowledge, not courts and judgments. Theology develops in dialogue with Plato and Aristotle rather than Roman legal terms. Even the spread of Christianity is affected. Missionaries moving into Northern Europe carry Greek, not Latin. Sacred words sound like echoes of Homer and Aristotle, not Roman law courts. This gives Christianity a different flavor, less imperial, more philosophical, woven into the fabric of Greek culture from the start. If language is the vessel of thought, then science and learning are the treasures carried within it. Greek, with its precision, flexibility, and vast vocabulary, is particularly well suited to intellectual inquiry. Aristotle himself created technical terms for logic, biology, and ethics that still resonate. In this alternate world where Greek dominates, scientific progress accelerates. Archimedes' discoveries in mathematics and engineering do not vanish into obscurity, waiting to be rediscovered in the Renaissance. Euclid's geometry remains a standard textbook across Europe for centuries without interruption. Galen's medical works, written in Greek, continue to influence physicians directly without needing Latin adaptation.
Crucially, the continuity of language means the chain of knowledge is never broken. In our world, the Middle Ages in Western Europe saw a partial eclipse of Greek science, only restored through translations from Arabic in the 12th century. In this alternate world, there is no such eclipse. The works of Aristotle, Archimedes, Ptolemy, and others remain in circulation, copied and taught in Greek schools from Iberia to Asia Minor. The Renaissance happens not in the 15th century, but much earlier.
perhaps in the 5th or 6th. Europe enters its age of invention centuries ahead of schedule. How does this continuity of Greek thought shape technology? The Greeks were curious inventors, but their fragmented politics often limited large-scale application. The Romans, by contrast, were master engineers, applying knowledge to roads, aqueducts, and military machines. In this alternate history, we must imagine a synthesis, Greek creativity combined with Greek dominance over the Mediterranean. Instead of Roman aqueducts, Greek-inspired engineering projects spread across Europe. Cities boast advanced water systems designed with Archimedean principles. Bridges and harbors are constructed with Greek architectural precision. Mechanical devices, like the Antikythera mechanism, which in our world remained a curiosity, might become templates for further invention. The very culture of debate and learning fosters innovation. In a world where every educated person learns Aristotle's logic and Archimedes' mathematics, problem-solving becomes part of daily life. Workshops and schools blur into one another. Provinces far from Athens begin experimenting with machines, tools, and techniques, encouraged by a shared intellectual heritage. Imagine, then, that the industrial age begins not in the 18th century, but perhaps in the 10th or 11th. Steam engines, inspired by Hero of Alexandria's designs, are not forgotten curiosities, but stepping stones toward practical machines. Astronomy advances steadily, unbroken by the gaps of history. Medicine progresses as Galen's works are debated and improved in Greek, without the bottleneck of translation.
The linguistic shift reshapes Europe itself. In our world, Latin's spread created the Romance languages, which later defined much of European identity. In this alternate world, instead of French, Spanish, or Italian, we might have Iberian Greek, Gallic Greek, and Italic Greek, regional dialects of one vast Greek tongue. The cultural unity of Europe becomes stronger, not weaker. While local customs survive, the shared language allows for a more connected intellectual and economic sphere. A merchant from Iberia can converse with a scholar from Athens without needing an interpreter. A priest from Gaul can read the same scripture as one from Alexandria without translation. Knowledge flows more freely across borders. This unity might prevent the kind of fragmentation that led to the feudal patchwork of medieval Europe. Instead, Europe develops with a stronger sense of cohesion, tied together by Greek speech and Greek identity. Political boundaries remain, but cultural ones blur. Language shapes art as much as it shapes science. In this Greek-dominated world, epic poetry remains a living tradition. Local poets write in the shadow of Homer, but also in the light of new experiences. Epics about voyages to Britain, dramas about Iberian heroes, comedies set in Gaulish villages. Theater thrives. Every city has its stage, every festival its plays. The Roman tradition of satire exists, but it is Greek comedy that defines public laughter. Instead of Latin literature becoming Europe's classic foundation, Greek literature expands endlessly, fed by new regions and new voices. Identity itself becomes Hellenic. To be Greek does not mean being from Athens or Sparta. It means being part of a culture that values philosophy, art, and inquiry. Farmers in Gaul might not look Greek, but their children learn to recite Homer. Traders in Iberia pray to Greek gods at temples. Even northern tribes begin to adopt Greek words and customs. When Greece remains the master of the Mediterranean, language itself changes the course of history. Greek becomes the common tongue, carrying philosophy, science, and scripture through the centuries without interruption. Knowledge flows more smoothly, theology develops differently, and innovation accelerates. It is easy to underestimate the power of words. But in this alternate world, Greek words shape everything, from the prayers of peasants to the discoveries of scientists. The West does not rediscover Greece after centuries of forgetting. It never loses Greece at all. The Renaissance begins centuries early. The Industrial Age follows more swiftly, and the world speaks in the language of Homer and Aristotle. In such a world, the question, what if Greece never fell to Rome, is not just about empires and armies. It is about the voices of daily life, the tongue of prayer, the speech of scholars, and the words whispered from parents to children. It is about the language of the world itself, and in this history, that language is Greek. History isn't only about soldiers, kings, or even languages. At its heart, it's about belief, about what people hold sacred, how they make sense of the universe, and what rituals guide their days. Religion is where cultures reveal themselves most clearly, because it is where ordinary people look for meaning. And here's the thing, when Greece never falls to Rome, faith itself takes a different path. In our history, by the 1st century BCE, Rome had effectively merged its pantheon with Greece's, but with a Roman character. Jupiter was more legalistic than Zeus. Mars was more central than Ares. The gods became symbols of Roman authority, marching alongside their legions. In this alternate world, without Rome subsuming Greece, the gods remain firmly Greek in character. Zeus doesn't become Jupiter. He remains the thunder-throwing king of Olympus. Athena continues to embody wisdom and craft, guiding both philosophers and artisans. Dionysus is still the god of revelry, wine, and a little chaos at the edges of polite society.
What this means practically is that the cultural imagination of Europe remains steeped in Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedies of Athens. Festivals to Dionysus are celebrated in Gaul and Iberia. Athena's temples rise not just in Athens, but in Londinium and Massilia. The Greek myths do not fade into classics studied by scholars. They remain living rituals woven into daily life. This prolongs the age of polytheism. While Christianity still emerges in the 1st century, its spread is slower in regions where Greek gods still command loyalty. Imagine a farmer in Gaul pouring out a libation to Demeter before sowing his wheat, or a fisherman in Britain whispering a prayer to Poseidon before setting sail. These practices continue for centuries, softening Christianity's advance, but also reshaping how it is understood. Of course, Christianity does spread. In fact, it may spread even more naturally here, because Greek is its native tongue. The New Testament was written in Greek. Paul's letters were Greek. The early debates of the church were all in Greek. In our history, the West translated these into Latin, creating a separate tradition. But in this alternate world, no translation is needed. From Jerusalem to Iberia, people read the same Gospels in the same language. This has two enormous consequences. First, the church remains united for much longer. In our history, the Great Schism split Christianity into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy in 1054. Much of that division stemmed from linguistic and cultural differences, Latin versus Greek, Roman authority versus Byzantine independence. In this world, with Greek uniting both East and West, there is no such split. Christianity develops as a single, pan-European faith, centered not in Rome, but in a network of Greek-speaking cities.
Second, theology itself takes a different shape. Latin Christianity emphasized law, sin, and authority, reflecting Rome's legal traditions. Greek Christianity emphasized mystery, philosophy, and divine union, reflecting Hellenic intellectual traditions. In our timeline, the Western Church became highly juridical, courtroom metaphors for sin, strict hierarchies of bishops, an almost bureaucratic view of salvation. In this alternate world, that juridical note never dominates.
Instead, the faith remains more mystical, philosophical, and poetic. Salvation is described as illumination, the soul's ascent to the divine, rather than a verdict in a courtroom. This naturally means Rome never becomes the seat of Christendom. Without Roman conquest and prestige, there is no pope in Rome with universal authority. Instead, the early pattern of councils, bishops meeting to debate doctrine, remains the norm. Leadership is collective, not centralized. The Bishop of Athens or Bishop of Constantinople might carry influence, but no single figure rises as supreme. The Christian world becomes less hierarchical, more collegial. Councils meet in Greek-speaking cities across the empire, with bishops from Gaul, Iberia, and Egypt debating in the same language. Heresies still exist, human beings will always argue, but the disputes unfold in a shared cultural and linguistic context. This prevents some of the harshest fractures of our history. The wars of religion, the endless debates about papal authority, the Protestant Reformation, these may never unfold in the same way. That does not mean a utopia. Power struggles exist in any faith, but the stage is set differently. Disputes remain within a single Greek Christian framework, rather than exploding into rival Latin and Greek traditions. Here's another twist. In our history, Christianity often clashed with pagan learning. Latin Christian authorities, suspicious of old Greek texts, allowed much of classical knowledge to wither. It was only through Islamic preservation and later rediscovery that Europe regained Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid.
In this alternate history, where Greek Christianity emerges in a Greek cultural world, pagan wisdom is never truly suppressed. Plato and Aristotle are not enemies of the Church, but conversation partners. Priests quote them in sermons. Theologians use their categories to explain doctrine. The plays of Sophocles and Euripides continue to be performed at festivals, perhaps given Christian reinterpretations, but never banned outright. This continuity of culture creates a faith far less hostile to philosophy and science. The Church encourages inquiry, not suspicion. Universities, when they emerge, are less about rigid theology and more about blending philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and scripture. The conflict between faith and reason, so famous in our world, is far less pronounced. What about daily life? For ordinary people, religion is not only counsels and theology, it is the rhythms of prayer, the cycle of festivals, the comfort of ritual. In this Greek-centered world, those rhythms remain closer to the old Hellenic traditions. Festivals are colorful, lively affairs. Where Latin Christianity sometimes moved toward solemnity, Greek Christianity retains a festival spirit. Easter, in particular, becomes a massive cultural celebration, blending Christian theology with the old Greek joy and feasting, music and dance. Saints are revered, but often with traits borrowed from older gods. A fisherman praying to Saint Nicholas might still think of Poseidon in the background. A healer invoking Saint Luke carries echoes of Asclepius. The very architecture of churches reflects this. Instead of the heavy Roman basilicas, Christian churches evolve from Greek temples and Byzantine domes, with light streaming through mosaics and icons. Across Europe, even in the far north, villages build small churches with rounded domes and painted walls, echoing the Aegean. Religion also shapes values. In our world, Latin Christianity emphasized obedience, authority, and duty, producing rigid hierarchies. Greek Christianity, in this alternate history, emphasizes contemplation, community, and harmony. This changes the tone of European society. Monasticism still exists, but in a different form. Instead of cloistered monasteries in Latin Europe, we see Greek-inspired communities of prayer and study, with monks copying not only scripture, but also science and philosophy. Women's religious life also shifts. Convents become centers of both contemplation and learning, reflecting Greek traditions of female participation in certain cults. Law, too, is colored differently. Without the heavy Roman legal tradition, Europe's moral framework is less about punishment and more about restoration. Communities focus on harmony, repentance, and balance. The harsh inquisitions of our world may never materialize. Instead, disputes are handled with debate, dialogue, and ritual reconciliation. If we follow this trajectory into the later centuries, the differences become even striking. A united Greek-speaking Christianity, preserving pagan wisdom and fostering inquiry, leads to an earlier flowering of knowledge. Europe enters something like the Renaissance, centuries ahead of our schedule. But it is not a rebirth, because the old knowledge never died. Colonial expansion, when it comes, takes on a different flavor. Missionaries sail not from Rome or Spain, but from Athens and Constantinople, carrying Greek Christianity to Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas. The language of global exploration becomes Greek, not Spanish or Portuguese. The Bible carried on ships to new worlds is written in the original Greek, not Latin translations.
Even the Enlightenment and modern science look different. Philosophers write not in French or German, but in modern dialects of Greek. Newton publishes in Greek. Darwin debates in Greek. The very vocabulary of modernity echoes Homer and Aristotle. And religion itself evolves differently. Without centuries of tension between faith and science, the two remain in closer conversation. Modern physics is explained in terms of Greek metaphors. Medicine draws upon unbroken lines from Hippocrates. The very soul of Europe remains Hellenic, centuries after Rome would have erased it. So what is the fate of the West when Greece never falls to Rome? It is a fate shaped by gods and faith, by the slow rhythm of rituals, by the enduring power of a single language. Zeus never becomes Jupiter. Athena never becomes Minerva. Christianity never splits into Latin and Greek halves. Instead, the faith of Europe remains Greek from the start, mystical, philosophical, and united. This creates a civilization with different priorities, more contemplative than legalistic, more unified than fragmented, more continuous than broken. The West does not lose its past and then rediscover it. It carries it seamlessly into its future. At the heart of it all is the enduring Greek spirit, a faith that can absorb old gods without forgetting them, a philosophy that can ask questions without fear, a language that carries memory across centuries. In this alternate world, the fate of the West is not Rome's shadow, it is Greece's light. And perhaps, if you were to walk through the streets of a city in this world, say Londinium or Massilia, you would hear hymns to Christ sung in Greek, children reciting Homer in school, and elders debating philosophy at the marketplace. You would hear the hum of a world still speaking the words of Plato and Paul, Aristotle and John in one unbroken voice. The fate of the West, then, is not a fall and a rebirth. It is a continuity, a stillness, a world carried forward on the gentle, unbroken current of Greek faith, Greek thought, and Greek words. Now let us set down our lanterns. We have walked far tonight, through the unbroken empire of Greece.
We've stepped into its markets, crossed its bridges, stood in its temples. We've listened to philosophers in the agora, watched children learning Homer in distant towns, and seen how language, faith, and daily life might have unfolded in a world where Greece never fell. We have tasted its food, heard its songs, smiled at its quirks, and felt the weight of its ideas. Not as ruins to be rediscovered centuries later, but as living, continuous, eternal. And now, as the night deepens, our path grows quiet. Picture yourself lying beneath the sky of that empire. The stars are bright, scattered and endless, the same constellations once traced by Greek sailors, the same heavens that guided caravans across the long roads. The fires in the distance burn low. The air is cool and safe and still. Breathe deeply. Let the centuries slip away. Let the empire dissolve into story. Because though this imagining is vast, your world right now is simple. Your breath, your blanket, your rest. So close your eyes. Drift slowly, peacefully. The empire is eternal in memory, but tonight, only your sleep is eternal. Rest well, traveler. Tomorrow will come, but for now, you are safe in dreams.